"Mom, something's moving inside the chimney, and Duke won't stop growling at it." That was how it started. Not with a casual morning walk or a cute tail wag, but with Duke, our usually goofy golden retriever, planted like a statue in front of the fireplace, his nose flared, his eyes locked on the soot-dark opening like it had personally insulted his ancestors. I'd never seen him like that before. Duke was a lover, not a fighter. The kind of dog who greeted burglars with a tennis ball. But that morning, his growl was low and constant, vibrating against the hardwood floors of our living room in Waynesville, North Carolina. The wind had picked up after a night of cold rain, and I figured maybe a squirrel had gotten trapped in the flue. Still, something about Duke's posture, tense, ears forward, one paw raised slightly off the floor, kept me frozen. My wife, Martha, was pouring coffee in the kitchen when I called her over. She peeked around the corner, brushing a streak of flour from her apron, and arched an eyebrow. "Well, that's new. You think it's stuck?" I nodded slowly. "Or nesting. Could be a raccoon." She walked over, leaned a bit toward the fireplace, and then jerked back as Duke snapped his head in her direction, lips curling just slightly. Not at her, but almost as if to say, "Don't." Our son Caleb came down the stairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes, wearing the ratty high school hoodie he refused to retire, even though he was already 20 and working part-time at the hardware store. "What's with Cujo?" "Shh," I whispered and pointed. "Something's in there." We stood in a triangle, silent except for Duke's rumble. I knelt beside him and reached toward the fireplace screen. He immediately placed a paw on my knee. Not pressing, not scratching, just stopping me. Caleb scratched his head. "Okay, that's creepy. Want me to call someone? Animal control?" Martha shook her head. "Let's open the flue first. Maybe it'll get spooked and climb back up." We cleared the area, and I gently eased the flue open. A rush of stale air pushed into the room. Duke didn't move, but his growl shifted. He was tracking something. Then the sound. It wasn't claws, not the scratching of an animal. It was softer, almost like fabric brushing against brick. Then a dull thump. Something hit the smoke shelf. Caleb took a step back. Guys? What if it's a person?" Martha gave him a look. "Why would there be a person in our chimney?" But Duke didn't wait for logic. The second the noise came again, louder this time, he lunged. Not into the fireplace, he couldn't, but toward it, barking now, tail stiff. That was when the soot dropped. It fell in clumps at first, then in a steady cascade. Duke backed off, barking like mad. Martha screamed, Caleb shouted, and I just stood there as something large and vaguely shaped like a bundle of clothes came sliding down and landed in a heavy, crumpled mess right on the hearth. I rushed forward, heart pounding. It wasn't moving. Duke sniffed once, growled again, then barked twice and turned circles. And then it groaned. Martha pulled Caleb behind her. I knelt beside the shape and realized it was a person, a man, maybe in his late 60s. Beard matted, skin smudged with soot, and who knows what else. He was muttering something under his breath. Duke moved closer, his nose nudging the man's side gently, then looked up at me and whined. "He's alive," I said. "Barely." We called 911, and while we waited, I wrapped the man in one of Martha's thick quilts. His eyes fluttered open for a moment. He looked around, confused, then fixated on Duke. "Good boy," he whispered, barely audible. It took a while for the paramedics to get him stabilized. They said he was malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from exposure. They didn't ask many questions, and the police who followed behind them seemed just as puzzled as we were. "No ID on him," the officer told me while standing on our porch, glancing at his notes. "He's not violent or anything. We'll take him to the hospital, then maybe check local shelters. Could have been looking for warmth and tried to hide out." Duke was watching from the window, still alert but calmer now, like his job was done. That night, none of us really slept, not even Duke. He laid by the hearth, occasionally sniffing the bricks like they still held some secret. The next morning, I went to the hospital. I didn't know why exactly. Something about the way the man had said "good boy" stuck with me. When I got there, a nurse told me he'd woken up briefly but hadn't said much. No memory, no name, just confusion. But when I stepped into the room, he looked up and smiled. "You brought the dog?" "Not today," I said. "But I can." He nodded. He saved me. I sat beside him, unsure what to say. "Do you remember how you ended up in the chimney?" He frowned. "Not really. Cold night. Was trying to stay warm. Last thing I remember was hearing a bark, then feeling safe." He closed his eyes again. I left the hospital with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Duke had sensed something none of us did. Not danger, exactly. Not fear. But something. Or someone that needed help. The days passed. The man, now registered as John Doe, remained at the hospital, slowly recovering. Caleb started calling him Chimney Jack. Even Duke seemed to understand. Every time I mentioned the hospital, he'd grab his leash. We brought Duke for a visit, and the change in Jack, yeah, we started calling him that too, was immediate. He sat straighter, smiled more, reached out with trembling fingers to stroke Duke's soft ears. Eventually, the doctors said Jack could be released. But he had nowhere to go. The shelters were full, and he had no known family. I looked at Martha across the dinner table that night and saw the answer in her eyes before she even said it. "We've got the guest room." So Jack moved in. At first, just for a little while. Just until something else opened up. But days turned to weeks, and he never left. He helped Martha with the garden, taught Caleb how to fix things beyond just hardware. And Duke was always at his side. One afternoon, as the first signs of spring began to show, Jack was sitting on the porch with Duke at his feet. I brought him a glass of iced tea and sat beside him. "You saved me, you know," he said. "We just opened the flu," I replied with a chuckle. "No," he said, nodding at Duke. "He did. He knew I was there. I wouldn't have made it through another night." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a story about a man in a chimney. It was about a dog who sensed something deeper, something hidden not just behind brick and soot, but behind the walls we put up when life breaks us. That was the beginning. And little did we know, it was only the beginning. Jack was already awake when I came down the stairs, the first rays of sun sneaking in through the kitchen blinds. He sat at the table sipping coffee, still dressed in one of Caleb's old flannel shirts and jeans that hung loose on his frame. Duke was curled beside his feet, snoring softly. "You're up early," I said, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Jack looked up, offered a small smile. "Habit. Old bones don't like beds as much as porches and sunrises." I poured myself a mug and sat across from him. "How'd you sleep?" "Like I used to," he said after a pause. "With a roof over my head." There was no bitterness in his voice, no self-pity, just a quiet reflection that settled over the kitchen like a soft blanket. The wind outside rustled the wind chimes on the porch. Duke stirred, stretched, then rolled over with a soft grunt. "You ever remember anything more?" I asked gently. "Before the chimney?" Jack shook his head. Bits and pieces. Nothing useful. Just moments. Some good. Some confusing. Martha entered, humming softly, her hair up in a bun and a tray of muffins in her hands. She kissed my cheek, handed Jack a muffin, and gave Duke a scratch behind the ears. They're blueberry. Caleb picked the good batch this time. Jack took the muffin with a grateful nod. You treat me like family. You are, she said, simple as that. Caleb came down not long after, already in his work uniform. Morning, gang. Muffins? Awesome. Gotta run, though. Mr. Halloway wants the inventory done by 10. Jack, I might need your help fixing that light fixture when I get back. Still flickers. Jack gave him a thumbs up. I'll check the wires. Probably just loose. After Caleb left, I noticed Jack glancing at the window often. It wasn't just idle. He was watching something, or waiting. Duke picked up on it too. Around midday, while Jack was trimming hedges in the backyard, Duke started pacing, moving between the kitchen and the back door. I followed him out and found Jack kneeling near the roses, still as stone, holding something in his hand. I walked closer and saw it was a small silver locket, dirt-covered and slightly bent. He wiped it clean with the edge of his shirt and stared at it for a long while. Where'd you find that? In the mulch, he said softly. Just now. Is it yours? He hesitated. I don't know, but it feels like I've seen it before. I crouched beside him. Want to open it? He nodded and carefully pried it open. Inside was a faded picture, too smudged to make out the faces clearly, but Jack stared at it like it held answers. You okay? Yeah, he said, though his voice caught. I think this was important once. I just don't know why. That night, he sat on the porch long after we went to bed. Duke stayed with him, resting his head on Jack's knee. In the morning, I found the locket placed carefully on the mantelpiece, beside Duke's treat jar. The days rolled on, a rhythm settling in. Jack became part of our home, fixing small things, making meals when Martha needed a break, walking Duke in the early mornings. But the past still hung around him like a fog that wouldn't quite lift. Then, one afternoon, the knock came. It was a woman, mid-40s maybe, dressed in a gray pantsuit, her face tense but polite. She introduced herself as Officer Jane Morris, a detective from Asheville. I heard about the man you found in your chimney. Mind if I ask a few questions? I nodded and brought her inside. Jack was in the garage with Caleb, but I called him in. As soon as he entered the living room, the detective's eyes widened slightly. She stood. You know him? I asked. She hesitated. I think so. We've had a missing persons case open for 2 years. A man named Thomas Price went missing from a small town near Boone. Similar age, similar build. Jack didn't react right away. He looked at her like she was a puzzle missing a few pieces. Does that name sound familiar? I asked. Jack rubbed his temple. Thomas, maybe, I don't know. Detective Morris opened a folder and showed him a photo. Jack squinted. His hands trembled as he took it. That's me, he whispered after a long moment. We all sat down. Morris explained that Thomas Price had been a retired mechanic who disappeared without warning. No foul play suspected, just a sudden vanishing. No note, no goodbye. His wife had passed the year before. He had a daughter, but they'd lost contact. We thought maybe he left on purpose, she said gently. Sometimes grief makes people run. Jack nodded slowly. I think I was running. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Jack, Thomas, was officially identified. There was paperwork, interviews, even a visit from a social worker. But it wasn't cold or clinical. Everyone could see how much we cared for him. His daughter, Anna, was found in Raleigh. They hadn't spoken in years, but when she got the call, she drove down within the day. I'll never forget the moment she stepped out of the car and saw him standing on our porch, Duke at his side. She ran to him without hesitation. "Dad," she cried, wrapping her arms around him. He held her like a man remembering how to breathe. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat with Jack on the porch again. "You've got your life back," I said. He looked down at Duke, then at the sky. "Feels strange. Like I'm living someone else's story. But it's mine, and this..." He nodded toward the house. "This was part of it too. Do you think you'll go back to Raleigh with her?" He was quiet a long time. "Eventually. She's got kids. Wants me to meet them. But not yet." "Why not?" He smiled. "Because I think there's still something I need to finish here." A week passed. Then 2. Jack visited Raleigh for a few days, met his grandchildren, saw his daughter's home. But he came back, just as he said he would. "Still got work to do," he said, when he walked through the door, setting his duffel bag down and scratching Duke behind the ears. And so, life returned to its new normal. Jack, or Thomas, was part of the family. Officially now. He even filed paperwork to legally share our address. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Thursday. No return address. Just our home, handwritten in neat, cursive letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper and an old photograph. This one not smudged. It showed a man in military uniform standing beside a younger Thomas. The note read, "I knew you'd come back. There's something you left behind. Look under the floorboards in the chimney." Jack stared at it for a long time, then looked at me. "I think it's time we found out what else Duke was growling at." We waited until Caleb got home. Martha made sandwiches. It felt oddly like preparing for a treasure hunt. With Duke watching curiously, we moved the rug and pried up the floorboard closest to the hearth. Beneath it was a cavity lined with old brick and dust, and sitting there, wrapped in an oilskin cloth, was a small wooden box. Jack lifted it out with care, as if it might shatter. He set it on the coffee table and opened it. Inside were 3 things: a dog tag, a faded map, and a folded letter addressed to T. Price. He picked up the tag first. It wasn't his name on it, but someone else's. Then the map, hand-drawn, showing the wooded area just outside town. And the letter. His hands shook as he opened it. He read it silently, then handed it to me. "He saved my life in '73, it began. Said if I ever needed to disappear, to come here, that the chimney would always be warm." Jack's voice cracked. "I think this was from an old war buddy. I must have come looking for that promise and forgot why." We sat in silence for a long time. Duke rested his head on Jack's knee, and Jack said, almost to himself, "I think I was meant to come here. And Duke, he knew. He's the reason I'm still breathing." The story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But we had the next piece of the puzzle now. And Duke, he'd just started digging into something even deeper. The next morning started with the kind of stillness that usually meant a storm was thinking about rolling in. Thomas, was already up and seated at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, the wooden box open in front of him, its contents spread carefully across a dish towel. Duke sat beside him, his nose resting on Thomas's foot, like they were locked into some private watch. Thomas tapped the dog tag with his index finger. The name is James Collier. Served with him in Nam. I remember now. He used to talk about having a place out here. Said if the world ever got too loud, this was where he'd vanish. Said I was welcome any time. I poured myself some coffee, watching him closely. You think that's who left the note? Could be, he said. Or someone who knew about the arrangement. Either way, I don't think it's random. He unfolded the map again, laying it flat on the table. There were marks on it, small X's near the river bend just past the ridge behind our property. You want to check it out? I asked. He looked up at me, eyes clear. Yeah, I do. By noon, the clouds had started gathering. Not thunderstorm dark, but enough to cool the air and make Duke's fur bristle in the breeze. Caleb volunteered to come with us, and Martha packed us sandwiches and a thermos of sweet tea like we were heading out on a picnic rather than a search for, well, we didn't know what exactly. The woods behind our home were part of an old trail network that used to lead to logging roads decades ago. Most of it had grown wild, but the terrain was familiar. Duke trotted ahead, sniffing the air, and occasionally glancing back to make sure we were keeping up. We reached the first X on the map after about 40 minutes of hiking. It was near a moss-covered boulder with a split down the middle, shaped oddly like a heart. Thomas stood still for a long time, then knelt and began brushing away leaves at the base of the rock. A patch of disturbed earth lay underneath. Here, he said. Caleb and I helped him dig, our hands black with damp soil within minutes. Eventually, we uncovered a rusted metal container about the size of a shoebox. Inside was a wrapped bundle and another letter, this one addressed simply to T. Thomas opened the letter while Caleb unwrapped the bundle. It held a photograph. 3 men in uniform, all laughing with arms slung around each other's shoulders. Behind them, a river and trees. One of the men was clearly Thomas. Another was the name on the dog tag, James Collier. The third man was unfamiliar. It's us, Thomas said, his voice tight. That was our last week before coming home. James said he buried some things here when he visited after the war. Keepsakes, memories he couldn't carry back into the world. The letter was simple, a few lines of reflection, an apology, and a favor. If you find this tea, take what you want. Burn the rest. No one else needs to carry it. We stared at each other. The silence of the woods pressed in. Back at the house, we laid out the items. Old letters, a few medals, a harmonica, and a journal too fragile to open without care. Duke sat beside the table, tail swishing slowly. You gonna keep these? Caleb asked. Thomas ran his fingers over the harmonica. Some, not all. James was trying to let go of something here. I don't want to undo that. The next day, we built a small fire pit near the back edge of the property. Martha watched from the porch. Thomas sat in the grass beside the fire, Duke curled beside him, while we burned what James had asked us to let go of. It wasn't a funeral. It wasn't somber. It felt more like closing a chapter. Afterward, Thomas said nothing for a long time. Then, as dusk crept in, he turned to me and said, You know, I thought I was running from something when I ended up in that chimney, but maybe I was running toward something, toward this. The days after that were quieter. Thomas spent more time walking the woods with Duke. Caleb had him over at the hardware store once a week, fixing old tools and tuning up dusty machines. He even started helping out with a few of the neighbors' repair needs. He didn't charge. Said it made him feel useful. One afternoon, our neighbor Susan came over with a box of old radios. Thomas got to work right away in the garage. Duke, never far, stayed curled up at his feet, as usual. But by the third radio, Duke began acting strangely. He stood up suddenly, sniffed the air, then paced back and forth in front of the workbench. "What's up, boy?" Thomas asked. Duke barked once, then twice. His nose pressed to the floorboard beneath the bench. He whined. Caleb and I were nearby, organizing tools. We exchanged glances and knelt beside Duke. The floorboard looked normal, but something had his attention. We pried it up. Underneath, buried in a small tin box wrapped in cloth, was another surprise. More dog tags. A different name this time. A name we didn't recognize. Thomas picked it up carefully, the metal dull with age. "I didn't bury this," he said. "And it's not James's." The mystery deepened. We searched the garage. No other boxes, no obvious clues. But there was something else, hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. A sealed envelope with a date scribbled across it. 1993. He opened it carefully. Inside was a short note. "If you find this, it means the dog found you first. Look beneath the second step." We raced back to the porch. The second step was weather-worn, but intact. We pried it up and found another tin. This one held photographs, black and white and faded, but clearly showing several different dogs over the years. All of them golden retrievers, all of them sitting beside someone, sometimes James, sometimes others. He wasn't just hiding memories, Thomas whispered. He was keeping watch. We pieced it together slowly. James hadn't just disappeared into the woods. He'd built a legacy of quiet guardianship, watchdogs who weren't just pets, but companions meant to find, alert, and protect. And Duke, somehow, was the latest in that line. That night, as the fireflies blinked in the backyard and Duke rested at Thomas's side, the air felt full, not with tension, but with the promise of something bigger. Something that went beyond one man, one chimney, or even one dog. "He must have raised them," Thomas said softly. "Trained them, passed it on, each one picking up where the last left off." Martha joined us with a blanket draped over her shoulders. "So Duke's not just ours?" "He's everyone's," Caleb said. We didn't speak much more that night. Words didn't feel necessary. Duke lay by the fireplace again. Just like that first morning, ears twitching, eyes alert. Whatever he was listening for, we didn't know. But we knew this. It wasn't over. Duke had found something, and he wasn't done yet. The next morning felt heavier somehow, like the air itself had thickened with the weight of whatever Duke had uncovered. None of us spoke about it right away. The breakfast table was quiet, except for the sound of the coffee machine dripping and Duke's gentle, thumping tail against the floor. Thomas had the dog tag from the garage in his hand, rolling it between his fingers. It had a name, E. Hollis, and a number that was half rusted over. There was no date, no context, just that slim piece of metal with history clinging to its edges. "You think it's someone James knew?" Martha asked as she slid scrambled eggs onto our plates. Thomas nodded slowly. "I'd bet on it. But more than that, I think it's someone he tried to keep safe." "What if Duke was trying to show us more than just this?" I asked. "What if we're missing something still?" Duke lifted his head at the sound of his name, then got up and padded into the living room. He paused in front of the fireplace again. Thomas followed. So did I. Duke didn't growl this time. He sat, ears perked, eyes fixed. Then, almost daintily, he placed a paw on the base of the hearth and looked up at us. "Well," Thomas said, crouching beside him, "we've been here before, haven't we, boy?" This time, we didn't just look inside the fireplace. We examined every brick, every seam, every nook. Eventually, Thomas ran his hand along the left side and stopped. "Here," he said. "Feel this. The mortar's different." We chiseled at it carefully, removing layer after layer until one brick slid loose. Behind it was a hollow pocket, and inside that, another box, smaller than the last. Wood, with brass corners and a latch that snapped open easily. Inside was a journal. This one had a leather cover, worn smooth with time. We opened it to the first page. "To whoever finds this, know that the stories we leave behind matter more than the ones we live alone." James. The entries dated back to the early 1980s. Not every day was documented. Some pages were just thoughts. Others were recountings of nights spent walking with a dog named Bramble, or fixing a roof for a neighbor named Dell, or hiding from the world when the noise got too loud. Then came entries about others, people who passed through. One name stood out. Hollis. "Found him shivering behind the barn," James wrote. "Said he just wanted to sleep. Let him rest in the loft. Dog doesn't like him. Not sure why." A few pages later. "Hollis left this morning. Took the radio. Bramble barked at the woods all night. Something's off." And finally, "If anyone finds this and you find the tag, it means I never figured out what happened to Hollis. But I hope he found peace." We all sat back after reading that. Duke whined softly and nosed the edge of the box. Thomas tapped the journal. "He kept track of everyone, every stray soul that passed through here." "Maybe Hollis came back," Martha whispered. "Or never left," Caleb added. The idea hung there. We decided to look deeper. Not into the chimney this time, but the land itself. Thomas remembered where the barn used to be. Only the foundation remained now, half covered in grass and wild vines. That afternoon, we walked out there with Duke leading the way, nose low to the ground, tail steady. At the edge of the old barn's footprint, Duke stopped. He barked once, then began pawing at the earth. We dug, slowly, carefully. What we found wasn't a body. It was a metal lockbox, the kind used for storing personal effects. Inside were three things: a notebook, a faded photograph of a young man in a military jacket leaning against the very barn we stood beside, and a scrap of newspaper with a headline about a burglary gone wrong from 1984. "That's him," Thomas said. "That's Hollis." The article said Hollis had been suspected of stealing from a local hardware store and disappeared soon after. No charges had been filed. No arrest made. The notebook had only a few entries. Most were scribbled half-thoughts, restless and confused. But one sentence was circled 3 times. "The dog knows. It always knows." That night, we sat around the fire pit again. Thomas read aloud from the journal, then from Hollis's notebook. The flames danced in Duke's eyes as he rested his chin on Thomas's boot. "You think he came back?" Caleb asked. "Maybe left the box, hoping someone would find it one day?" "Or maybe he was trying to confess," Thomas said. "Maybe he thought the dog wouldn't let him get away with it." It was hard to say for sure. The pieces didn't quite form a full picture. But there was something undeniably true in that line. The dog knows. Over the next week, we started compiling everything we'd found. The journals, the dog tags, the maps, the notes. Thomas spent his evenings cataloging the items and writing out what he remembered. "It should be shared," he told me, "not just hidden again. People need to know." So we helped him. We scanned pages, took photos, created a binder we could take to the local library. Martha called the Historical Society. They were interested immediately. Duke remained vigilant, always watching, always listening. Then came the day he ran. It was early morning. Mist still clung to the ground. Thomas had gone out with him for a walk, same as every morning. But an hour passed. Then 2. And when we called, no one picked up. Finally, Thomas called back. His voice was tight. He bolted, took off into the woods behind the ridge. I couldn't catch him. He's gone. We dropped everything. Martha stayed by the phone in case he came back. Caleb and I joined Thomas in the woods. We called. We searched. Hours passed. Still nothing. Then, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, we heard it. A single, sharp bark. We followed the sound to a clearing we'd never seen before. And there, beneath an old, twisted pine tree, was Duke. Beside him was a shallow depression in the earth, something half buried. We ran to him. It wasn't another box this time. It was a headstone, small, covered in moss. We cleared it slowly. James Collier, it read, beloved friend, guardian, and keeper of peace. Duke laid down beside it, resting his head in the grass. Thomas knelt and touched the stone. He's been here all along, watching, waiting, and Duke, he found him. It was quiet for a long time. No birds, no wind, just the sound of Duke's breathing, steady and calm. That night, we returned with flowers, and a new stone we carved ourselves beside it, one that simply said, "The dog knew." The mystery wasn't over, not really, but some part of it had come full circle. James had trained generations of dogs to guard something more than a home. And Duke, in his own way, had shown us that the past doesn't always stay buried. Thomas looked at the stars that night and said, I think he was waiting for someone to come back. And now that we're here, maybe we can keep the watch going. Duke licked his hand and closed his eyes. Whatever he had been born to do, he was still doing it, and he wasn't done yet. The day after Duke found James Collier's grave, the weather shifted. The air was warmer, the breeze gentler. The wind chimes on the porch played their quiet tune, like a whisper of thanks. Something in the world felt settled, but not still. Thomas stood out by the headstone every morning now, coffee in hand, Duke sitting faithfully beside him. Sometimes he'd say something under his breath, like a prayer or a memory surfacing. Other times, he just watched the horizon, like he was expecting someone or something. We didn't question it, not anymore. It wasn't superstition, not exactly. It was just trust. Trust that Duke would know what to do when the moment came. It came sooner than we thought. 2 weeks later, a white van pulled into our driveway. It had no logos, no markings. A man stepped out, mid-50s, tidy gray beard, a clipboard in his hand, and a cautious expression on his face. He wore a windbreaker and dusty jeans. Duke was at the door before we even noticed the van. He didn't bark. He just stared. The man walked up, removed his cap. "Afternoon," he said, glancing toward Duke. "This the place with the golden retriever that found someone in the chimney?" I opened the door slowly. "Depends on who's asking," he smiled faintly. "Name's Paul Minter. I run a group that tracks, well, let's call them unusual canine events. Your dogs come up on our radar." Martha joined me, towel in hand, her brow furrowed. "Radar?" He nodded. "Not government, just interested parties. We gather stories, sometimes patterns, There's been a string of dogs, always retrievers, always trained by a man named James Collier. Your Duke matches." Thomas walked out behind us, arms crossed. "You knew James?" Paul nodded. "Long time ago, back when he still passed through Colorado. He had a dog then, Tango. Saved 3 people from a house fire before vanishing. We didn't know what happened to James after that. Until now." He stepped carefully inside, and we offered him a seat. Duke sat by Thomas, never taking his eyes off the man. "We think James trained a whole bloodline," Paul said. "Not just in obedience, in intuition, rescue, response. Maybe even something deeper." Caleb leaned against the wall. "You're saying it's… what? A secret network of dogs?" Paul gave a sheepish grin. "Sounds silly when you say it like that. But yes, we've documented nearly a dozen cases across 4 states. All similar, all involving retrievers that seemed to know when people needed help, even before they asked." He opened a folder and laid out photos. Yellowed clippings, snapshots of dogs with strangers, letters from survivors. "Duke fits the pattern." Thomas leafed through the pictures. "Why now? Why come to us?" "Because Duke's the first one in over a decade that's been found by people willing to ask questions. Most just move on. They don't dig, they don't listen." Martha poured coffee for everyone. The silence stretched. "What do you want with him?" I asked. "Nothing bad," Paul said quickly. "We don't take dogs, we don't tag or test, we just document, learn. I was hoping, if you're willing, you'd let me observe. Maybe follow Duke, see where he leads next." Thomas looked down at the dog. Duke looked back, then stood, walked over to Paul, and placed a paw on his shoe. It was enough. Over the next few days, Paul stayed in the guest room. He followed Duke on walks, took notes, recorded behavior patterns. Duke didn't seem to mind. He was his usual self, gentle, alert, curious. But it became clear quickly that something was changing. He started waking earlier, barking at strange times. Once, he led Paul out to the old train bridge near the creek, only to sit down and stare across the water for 20 minutes before turning around and walking home. Paul was fascinated. "He's mapping something, I swear. He's checking boundaries, revisiting points." Thomas started joining them, and on the 3rd morning of their new routine, Duke bolted again. Not in panic. In purpose. We followed him down an old deer trail that wound around the ridge and behind an abandoned farmhouse we didn't know existed. It was half swallowed by vines, roof sagging, porch splintered. Duke paced the yard, then stopped at the cellar door. It was locked. But Duke scratched once, then sat. Paul and I forced it open. The cellar stairs groaned as we descended. It smelled of mildew and time. But what struck us first wasn't the rot. It was the shelf, stacked neatly with journals, boxes, photographs, and a folder labeled Duke. Thomas opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single note. "He's ready." The journals were all James's handwriting. Each one chronicled a different dog. Their births, their personalities, their moments of choice, times they'd found someone, changed a life, intervened without prompt. "They're not just pets," Paul said softly. "They're sentinels." We spent hours down there, cataloging what we could. Duke waited at the door the whole time, patient and still. When we emerged, something had shifted. Not just in us, but in the air around the house. Duke had taken up his post again at the hearth, tail curled around his legs, eyes distant. Thomas sat with him. "You're not just part of the story. You are the story." Duke blinked slowly. Paul decided to stay a little longer, not as a researcher, but as someone who now felt part of something bigger. He offered to help us digitize the materials, get them stored safely, shared with the right people. Caleb started calling it the Collier Project. We didn't need to give Duke a new mission. He already had one. But we began paying closer attention. Every bark, every pause, every turn of the head. Was it instinct? Or something learned over generations? Whatever the answer, we knew this. He wasn't done. Because Duke, somehow, always knew when someone else needed to be found. And somewhere out there, someone else was waiting. We just didn't know where yet. But Duke would lead us there. 3 weeks after we found the cellar beneath the abandoned farmhouse, a letter arrived. It wasn't postmarked. It wasn't even mailed. It was placed directly under our welcome mat, folded neatly in a plain white envelope. No name, no address. Just a single word written in clean, block letters across the front. Listen. Thomas found it when he stepped out to water the garden. He brought it in, already frowning. Duke sniffed it, gave one low huff, then sat beside the door. We gathered around the table as Thomas opened the envelope. Inside was a short, typed note. "There are others, north of the bend. You'll know when the dog stops. Leave nothing behind. JC." "That's James," Thomas said quietly. "It has to be." "North of the bend?" Caleb repeated. "That's near the logging trail, isn't it? The one by the old mill run?" I nodded. "Haven't been there in years. Mostly overgrown now." Paul looked at Duke, who was still sitting by the door, ears forward. "I think he's already decided we're going." We packed supplies and headed out by mid-morning. Martha stayed behind in case someone came by again. Thomas, Paul, Caleb, and I followed Duke through the woods, the map from James's journals folded in Thomas's back pocket. The trail bent sharply past a ridge marked by a cluster of ancient pine. Duke slowed there, nose twitching, then turned left, off the path, and into the underbrush. We followed, ducking under branches, weaving through brambles. Then he stopped. A clearing opened in front of us. Not large, but deliberately carved out. At the center stood what looked like a stone pedestal, moss-covered and sunken slightly into the earth. Around it, 6 wooden posts circled the space, old rope still dangling from their tops. It looked like some kind of forgotten monument. Duke approached the pedestal and sat. Thomas stepped forward. "You think this is what the letter meant?" Paul circled the area, taking photos. "It's not on any of the forestry maps I've seen. Nothing marks this spot." We cleared away some of the moss. On the pedestal's top, carved into the stone, was a series of initials: JC, TP, AL, DR, BF, and DC. Thomas ran his fingers over the last one. "That's me, David Collier, my birth name. He knew I'd come back." The realization hit like a gust of wind. These weren't just random initials. They were the names of those James had trusted, those who'd taken part in what he built. This wasn't a grave. It was a marker. A waypoint. Paul knelt beside the pedestal. "There's something buried beneath it. I can feel the air gap." We spent the next hour carefully removing the soil around the base until we found a hatch made of reinforced wood and iron. A latch opened smoothly with a loud creak. Below it was a narrow stairwell, dry and surprisingly intact. Duke didn't hesitate. He led the way. The passage opened into a low room lined with shelves and crates. This time it wasn't just journals. There were maps, tools, a generator, a ham radio set, dusty but intact. Files labeled with town names, dates, and notes scrawled in James's handwriting. And in the center of the room, a cot with a folded blanket. "He lived here," Thomas whispered. "For a while, at least." We spent hours sorting through everything. One box held detailed field reports on dog training schedules. Another had weathered photos, each one showing different retrievers, each with a name written on the back. One file was labeled Transition Candidates. Inside were notes on temperament tests, behavioral markers, and a dozen names we didn't recognize. Some were crossed out. One was circled. "Duke," Thomas said, holding the page up. "He planned it all. He knew Duke would end up with us." Paul pulled out a crate from the far wall. Inside was a sealed envelope labeled Final Directive. We opened it. "If Duke finds this place, you've already begun to understand. He is the last in this line, but not the end. Others will come. Train them. Trust them. Let them listen, and they'll guide you. If you're reading this, the work isn't finished." Caleb exhaled slowly. He was building something bigger than just rescue dogs. Thomas looked at Duke, who was sniffing one of the shelves. He was building guardians. We spent 2 more days inventorying everything, hauling it out piece by piece with a sled made from old lumber and rope. Duke came and went, pacing the perimeter of the clearing like he was keeping watch. Back at the house, Martha helped organize the materials in the garage. Paul stayed up late, transferring files to his laptop. Thomas began building a better shelter near the clearing, something weatherproof. Caleb and I put up motion lights and cameras, just in case someone else came looking. Then, the radio clicked. We were cleaning up after dinner when we heard it. Static at first. Then a single word. Help. Paul raced into the garage. The ham set was glowing faintly. The transmission was weak, but clear enough to catch 2 more words. Stuck and cabin. Duke was already on his feet, tail up, body rigid. We loaded the truck with supplies and grabbed the radio. Using the maps, we triangulated the signal source, a stretch of woods near Elk Ridge, 30 minutes out. The drive was tense. Duke stared out the window the whole time. As soon as we reached the trailhead, he jumped out and began leading us in a zigzag path, pausing every few feet to sniff, listen, then continue. Eventually we found it, a dilapidated hunting cabin, barely visible under a tangle of vines. Inside, curled near the fireplace, was a young man, mid-20s, dehydrated, shivering, and scared out of his mind. He'd wandered off during a hike 2 days ago, slipped in the rain, and hurt his leg. The radio set had been his grandfather's. He'd found it in a drawer and in desperation turned it on. "Didn't think anyone would hear," he whispered as we gave him water. Duke sat beside him, leaning gently into his side. We got him out, took him to the hospital. The story made the local news. Dog finds missing hiker thanks to vintage radio signal. No one mentioned James, or the journal, or the underground room. But we knew. So did Duke. Back home, Thomas added the date and name to the binder we were building. Recovery number 1. Paul smiled. The beginning of the new watch. Duke lay under the table, eyes closed, tail twitching softly. Whatever had guided James to build this legacy had found its next chapter. And Duke was ready for it. He always had been. Word of Duke's rescue spread faster than we expected. What began as a short news segment on local TV was picked up by regional outlets, then trickled into a few online articles. Golden Retriever leads rescuers to injured hiker became the headline, accompanied by photos of Duke sitting solemnly beside the recovered man's stretcher. We hadn't gone public with the deeper story, the journals, James Collier's legacy, or the underground room, but curiosity stirred all the same. Within a week, we started receiving letters, emails, voicemails, some from people who'd owned golden retrievers that acted strangely just before they found themselves in danger, or saved. Some wanted to share their stories. Others simply wanted to thank us for caring about a dog that clearly had a calling. Paul began logging each one in what he called the Sentinel Archive. It grew daily. Then came the letter from Montana. It was handwritten, neat cursive, and addressed not to us, but to James Collier, mailed to our house. Dear James, I don't know if you're still alive, but if you are, I need help. I think my dog was one of yours. Her name was Scout. She died last winter, but before that, she found something buried near our old fence. I don't know what it means. I'm scared. Please send someone who understands. It was signed, M. Sir Donnelly, Bozeman, Montana. Thomas laid the letter down carefully. She doesn't know James is gone. Caleb tapped the envelope. But somehow she got his name. Martha crossed her arms. And our address. Paul leaned over. I think she's one of the ones he trained from afar, or one of the people who adopted a dog from someone connected to him. We need to go. The discussion that followed wasn't easy. We had responsibilities, work schedules, lives rooted in North Carolina. But the story was no longer just ours. And Duke, well, the moment the suitcase came out, he sat beside it like he'd been expecting the trip. Thomas, Paul, and I made the drive across the country. We took the old truck, packed light, and planned a few nights in motels along the way. Duke rode in the back seat, head always near the window, eyes scanning every stretch of land like he was tracking invisible threads. Montana was colder than expected. We arrived mid-morning at a modest farmhouse surrounded by a long wire fence, brittle under snow-dusted grass. A woman in her 60s opened the door before we knocked. You came, she said. I didn't think anyone would. She introduced herself as Maggie Donnelly. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, but her voice was steady. She led us to the backyard, where she pointed out the place her dog Scout had fixated on for weeks before passing. She kept digging here, Maggie said. Always here? Even when the ground froze. I thought it was just squirrels or something, but then she'd just sit, hours, watching. We knelt beside the spot. Duke stood still, tail stiff, then began to sniff. And he barked. Only once, sharp, commanding. We started digging. It didn't take long. Beneath the frozen soil, wrapped in plastic, was a metal container. Inside, sealed in wax paper, were several folded documents, some official, some handwritten. There was an old badge, a passport with a clipped corner, and a note. Buried for safekeeping. I couldn't carry it anymore. I hoped she'd find someone who could. Paul read the documents carefully. These are real. This is intelligence, government level, dates from the early 90s. This person was hiding from something. Maggie stared at the papers. Scout found this, and she wanted someone to see it. We took photos, copied every page. We didn't involve the authorities. Yet. There were too many questions still unanswered. Back inside, Maggie told us about her late husband, who had briefly worked in defense contracting. Scout had come to them through a rescue service they never could trace back fully. She was different, Maggie said, looking at Duke. Like him. She knew things. She saved us once from a gas leak, before the alarm even went off. That night, Thomas sat outside with Duke beneath the wide Montana sky. I joined him with 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "It's happening again," Thomas said. "The pattern, the people. Duke's waking it all back up." I nodded. "But why now?" He watched the stars. "Because someone out there is still in danger. And the line isn't broken. It just needed the right dog to start running again." We stayed a few more days, helping Maggie organize the documents, uploading scans to Paul's archive. Then we returned home. Duke slept the whole drive back, content in a way he hadn't been in weeks. But we weren't home long before the next signal arrived. This one wasn't a letter, it was a child. Late one evening, as a storm rolled in, a knock echoed on the door. A boy stood there, 10, maybe 11, clutching a soaked backpack, hair plastered to his forehead. "Are you the dog people?" he asked. Martha knelt beside him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "Who sent you?" "Nobody," he said. "But my sister said if anything happened, I had to find the dog that knows. She told me to come here." Thomas stepped forward, voice calm. "What's your name, son?" "Ben," he said. "Ben Collier." We froze. Thomas's eyes widened. "Collier?" The boy nodded. "My dad said I was named after someone, but he's gone now." Martha ushered him inside, drying his hair. Caleb brought out hot soup. Ben told us what he knew. His sister had been researching something, old stories about dogs that saved people, about a man who trained them. She kept a file, wrote letters. When their home caught fire, and she didn't make it out, she told Ben to run, told him where to go. She said the dog would understand. Duke sat beside him, then rested his head on the boy's knee. Ben didn't cry. He just leaned into the dog and whispered, "You were real. She was right." That night, as the storm pounded outside, we added another file to the archive. Ben wasn't just a runaway. He was a piece of the puzzle. And Duke, somehow, already knew what came next. The storm rolled out by morning, leaving everything soaked and silent except for the occasional drip of water from the eaves. Ben was still asleep on the couch, bundled in blankets, Duke curled up at his feet like a living shield. None of us had the heart to move him. When he did finally stir, his first word was the dog's name. "He stayed the whole night." "He does that," Martha said, placing a warm bowl of oatmeal in front of him. "You're safe here." Paul came in from the garage, holding one of the scanned documents from Maggie's place. He nodded toward the boy. "We need to ask him a few questions soon. There's more to this." Thomas leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. "Not until he's ready. We go slow." Ben glanced between them. "You're talking about the binder. My sister had one. She called it the map of the invisible. I didn't understand it. Just pictures of dogs and notes and weird names. But she said it meant people were being watched over." "Did she mention James Collier?" Paul asked gently. Ben nodded. "She called him the first watcher, said he trained the ones who could hear the quiet warnings. She believed in him. She said if I ever got scared, I had to find the dog that still listened." We didn't tell him yet that James was gone. We let him eat. Later that day, Caleb and I took Ben for a walk with Duke. It was warm again, spring trying its best to reclaim the ground. Ben walked in silence most of the way, one hand on Duke's back. "He's not just a dog, is he?" Ben asked, not looking up. "He is," I said. "And more." Ben nodded like he already knew. "Scout was like that too. That was our dog. My sister found her tied up behind a gas station. She said the way the dog looked at her, it was like being chosen." We came back to find Paul standing over a pile of new letters. Most were the usual, people sharing stories, asking if their dog might be part of something greater. But one was different. This one came in a black envelope, no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a golden retriever standing in front of a building with barred windows and ivy crawling up the side. On the back, in handwritten block letters, "He's still there." Paul scanned the building, ran the photo through reverse image search, and matched it to a decommissioned juvenile center in Northern Virginia. Closed since 2006. "We need to go," he said. Thomas glanced at Ben. "He comes too. It's too dangerous. He's safer with Duke than anywhere else." We left the next day. Ben packed his few things into a backpack, including a worn photo of his sister and a folded note with her handwriting. "If you find the others, tell them I tried." The drive took 8 hours. The building sat at the end of a long gravel road, hidden behind rusted gates. The air was still, but Duke immediately stiffened the moment we stepped out of the truck. He walked forward slowly, ears back, body tense. Inside, it smelled of mold and dust. The floors groaned with every step. But Duke kept moving, always pausing, sniffing, waiting. In the third hallway, he stopped completely, then sat. Paul pointed to a door labeled Staff Storage. We pried it open. Behind a collapsed shelving unit was a large metal cabinet. The lock was broken. Inside were files, dozens of them, stamped with old state logos. And behind those, another journal. Not James's this time. The handwriting was neater, younger. "This was someone else," Thomas said. "Another keeper." The journal described an effort to place specially trained dogs with children who had no families, especially those in state custody. It hinted at a pilot program funded quietly, shut down after 5 years. No formal records. Ben read over Paul's shoulder. "My sister had something like this in her binder. She said it was proof that someone kept trying to restart the network." The journal mentioned 7 dogs placed during the program. 5 had been tracked. 2 lost. 1 tagged simply as Kilo. Last seen in the facility. No record of removal. Duke moved to a corner of the room and began to paw at the wall. Ben knelt beside him. "Is he here?" We started pulling away panels. Behind the last one, hidden in a shallow recess, was a small wooden crate with air holes. Inside, wrapped in a worn towel, were bones. Duke whined. Ben touched the edge of the box. "They left him." Martha always said some dogs had hearts that broke long after they stopped beating. Maybe Duke was mourning. Or maybe he was just honoring the promise. We buried Kilo beneath a tall oak outside the compound. Ben placed a stone marker at the base. So no one forgets. The journal, the files, we took them all. Another piece of the map. That night, in the motel, Thomas went through the files again. One note slipped free from the back of the folder, a simple line scribbled in red. One more left. Seek the lighthouse. Paul pulled out his laptop. Within minutes, he found it. An abandoned lighthouse off the coast of South Carolina. Last used by the Coast Guard 15 years ago. Now managed by a local heritage trust. We left the next morning. Ben didn't hesitate. None of us did. The drive was long, the final ferry ride even longer. The island was small, ringed with rocky shoreline. The lighthouse towered above everything, its glass top glinting in the sun. Duke jumped from the boat the moment we landed, running ahead with surprising speed. He circled the base of the lighthouse 3 times before settling by the door. Inside, it was quiet. Cleaner than expected. A man sat at the base of the spiral staircase, mid-70s, weathered face, a cane across his lap. "Took you long enough," he said. Ben stepped forward. "Who are you?" "The last one James trained," the man replied. "Name's Clayton. I stayed behind to watch until the dog came back." Duke approached him slowly. Clayton rested a hand on his head. "I saw the sign," Clayton said. "The photo, the marker. I knew the line had awakened again. You've all done well, but there's more." He handed Thomas a sealed envelope. "James knew it would take decades. He counted on the dogs to outlive our timelines. This letter has the next site, the last legacy." Clayton stood slowly. "I can't go with you, but the dog, he'll know what to do. He always does." That night, we sat by a fire on the beach, listening to the waves. Ben stared at the sky, Duke pressed against his side. "What if there are more kids like me?" he asked. "What if they don't have anyone yet?" "Then we find them," Thomas said. "One by one, as long as Duke keeps listening." Ben nodded. "Then we don't stop." We wouldn't, because the map of the invisible was still unfolding. And Duke was still leading the way. The envelope Clayton handed us that night was thick with time. The seal was intact, its edges worn smooth as if held by many hands before finally reaching ours. We didn't open it until morning, after coffee and quiet reflection beneath the lighthouse's faded paint and salty air. Duke sat beside Ben, watching the waves crash against the rocks like he'd seen it all before. Inside the envelope was a map, drawn by hand, just like the others. It showed a stretch of desert near New Mexico, with a red X marked beside an old mining symbol. There were no labels, no directions, just a series of coordinates scribbled in pencil and a single phrase beneath them. "Where silence first met the howl." Paul studied the map. "That's near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Nothing out there but old mines and rock." "And another piece of the puzzle," Thomas said, folding the map with care. We said goodbye to Clayton before the ferry came. He hugged Ben like a grandfather would. "Watch the dog," he told him. "He'll speak. Not with words, but you'll know." The drive west took 3 days. The roads thinned, traffic faded, and by the end of the 3rd day, we were deep in the kind of silence that stretched across the horizon like an old promise. The coordinates led us off-road. We hiked the final mile with backpacks, water, and Duke bounding ahead, energized by the open space. He paused at every turn, sniffed the wind, then kept going. Eventually, we found it. A collapsed cabin, little more than broken beams and dust, nestled between 2 red cliffs. A rusted tin sign lay half-buried in the dirt. "Silver Pennants Mine, Est 1903. Duke walked around the debris, nose to the ground. Then he stopped near what remained of the entrance shaft. The wood supports had long since rotted, but a narrow passage led down into the rock. Ben stepped forward. "He wants to go in." We hesitated. The shaft was narrow, the air heavy. But if Duke was sure, we had to follow. Paul set up a small radio beacon and headlamps. We descended slowly, ducking through tight turns and shallow steps. The mine had been abandoned for decades, but someone had been here since. The walls bore fresh marks, chalk arrows, notches, signals. And then the air shifted. We found a door, built into the rock itself, hidden by the natural curve of the mine. Metal reinforced, bolted, and sealed with something that looked like an access wheel from a submarine. Thomas looked at Paul. This wasn't made by miners. We opened it slowly. The hinges groaned, then gave way. Inside was light, dim, faint, but electric. A generator hummed somewhere in the walls. The room beyond the door wasn't large, but what it held was overwhelming. Racks of books, filing cabinets, photos pinned to corkboards, a radio station, 2 bunks, and in the center, another golden retriever. Alive, old, gray around the eyes, but standing. He looked at Duke and didn't move. Duke stepped forward, sniffed, and let out a single bark, not loud, not commanding. Almost respectful. Then a voice came from the far side of the room. I was starting to think no one would come. A man stepped forward, tall, thin, in his 60s, weathered, beard like rust. He leaned on a cane and wore a shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in months. My name's Evan, he said. And this here's March, last of his line, or so I thought. Duke and March were sniffing one another, tails slowly wagging. It felt like a reunion, or a passing of a torch. Evan gestured us to sit. James trained me in '84, said I'd have one job, wait, and when the dog comes, open the vault. He moved to a panel and pressed a switch. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were 3 sealed crates. Everything James kept hidden when things got too loud. Instructions, tech, contacts, people who owed him, and people he owed. It's all here. We opened the crates. Inside were hard drives, microfilm, and more letters. Letters addressed to names we didn't know, some postmarked but never sent. There was a binder labeled Phase 3. Paul opened it first. This wasn't just about finding people. James wanted to start something permanent, a place, a training center. Not for dogs, for people. People who listen. People who follow the dogs. Thomas scanned the room. Like us. Evan nodded. He said it had to be built when the world was ready, when enough were found who believed in what the dogs were showing us. Not just danger, but direction. Ben sat with March and Duke, one arm draped over each of them. Then it's time. We stayed in the mine for 3 days, documenting everything. Evan showed us journals, recordings, and lists. March never left Duke's side. When we finally left, Evan didn't come. My work's done, he said, but yours, it's just beginning. Back in North Carolina, we converted the garage into a command center. Paul networked the drives. Caleb installed better security. Martha cleared space in the attic for the archive. Ben painted a wooden sign that read, The Watch House. Letters kept coming. Stories. Dogs. Dreams. We started answering them. One by one, Duke led us through each message. Some were simple acts of comfort, others more complex. A boy in Alabama who hadn't spoken in weeks began talking again after Duke sat with him. A woman in Missouri claimed her father's retriever had found her journal when she was about to give up. A family in Oregon said their dog barked at a storm shelter moments before a tornado hit. And everywhere, people asked the same question. How do they know? Ben had the answer. Because they were trained to listen when no one else would. And Duke, he kept listening. He never missed a thing. And he never stopped waiting. Because he knew there were still more out there, still waiting to be found. The wind carried the scent of pine and rain as the first morning of spring broke over the ridges behind the house. The watch house, Ben's hand-painted sign still swinging gently by the porch, stood quiet, but not still. Inside, the hum of servers and the soft scratch of pens on paper were the only signs of the movement underway. Thomas was already up, tending the kettle, his hand steady now where once it trembled. Paul sat cross-legged in front of the archive shelves, filing away the latest set of letters, stories from New Hampshire, Oregon, and a tiny fishing town in Alaska. Each letter told of dogs who knew when no one else did, who saved, who waited, who barked at just the right moment. Duke lay in the center of the room, ears twitching even in sleep. Ben had fallen asleep beside him again. Books open, a pencil tucked behind one ear. Caleb came in from the garage, breathless. "You'll want to see this." We followed him to the monitor where Paul had installed a motion-activated camera feed near the edge of the property. On the screen, headlights, a car pulling slowly up the gravel drive. A woman stepped out, not hurried, but hesitant, and in her arms, wrapped in an old blanket, was a golden retriever pup. "She's here," Caleb said, "like they always are." We opened the door before she could knock. She looked surprised, maybe even spooked. Then she saw Duke, who had come to stand beside Ben. She dropped to her knees. "He led us here. Every time we stopped, he barked until we got back on the road. My husband thought I was imagining it, but I knew." She handed over the pup. "He was born the day our house burned down. My father's dog, an old golden, pulled him from the kennel before the roof caved in. Then he laid down and didn't get back up. This one hasn't stopped following me since." Ben took the pup in his arms. The dog nuzzled into him like they already knew each other. "What's his name?" Thomas asked. "I haven't given him one," she said. "I think he already has one." Duke sniffed the pup once, then barked. Not loud, just once. A sound of confirmation. Paul smiled. "He's ready." We added another file to the system. Another name. Another story. As the weeks passed, more came. Not always with dogs in tow, but with questions, with fragments of history. Photos, newspaper clippings, even a child's crayon drawing of a golden dog standing in front of a fire truck. We had become more than watchers. We were keepers of something fragile and vast, a web of silent guardians, spanning generations. And Duke had started slowing down. It was subtle at first. Shorter walks, longer naps, a slight stiffness when the weather changed. He still listened, still barked when he needed to, still curled beside Ben when the boy had a nightmare. But the energy that once sent him bounding across fields had quieted. We didn't talk about it. Not really. But we knew. Then one morning, Ben woke before all of us. He sat on the porch in his pajamas, Duke beside him. They watched the sky. When I brought out coffee and a blanket, Ben said nothing for a long time. "He's tired," he finally said, "but he's not sad." Duke rested his head on Ben's foot. "He said it's almost time," Ben whispered. He didn't speak, but I heard it, the way he's taught me to. Later that afternoon, Duke rose from his spot by the hearth and walked to the door. We all followed as he led us beyond the trees, past the garden, to the hill where the sunrise hit first each day. He lay down in the grass. We gathered around him. Thomas, Paul, Caleb, Martha, Ben. The pup was there too, quiet as a shadow. No words were spoken. None were needed. Duke closed his eyes, and the world held still. We buried him beneath the old oak, beside the stone we'd placed for James, for Scout, for March and Kilo and all the others whose names had become part of the unseen thread. Ben carved Duke's name into the stone himself. But he didn't cry, because that night, as the first stars appeared, the pup, who had remained silent since arriving, sat up, barked once, and trotted to the front door. Ben smiled. "He's ready." And so it began again. The letters never stopped. The stories kept coming. And the watch house stayed open, its doors never locked, its lights never dark, because there would always be someone out there needing to be found, and there would always be a dog, golden, listening, waiting, ready to lead the way home.